Welcome to Crucial Conversations from the Rialto Center for the Arts in downtown Atlanta. I'm Doug Blackman, a professor at Georgia State University and author of the Pulitzer Prize-winning book, Slavery by Another Name. Joining me here on the stage of the Rialto are Shonda Harper and Alana Lark. Both of them recent graduates of Georgia State, now working in Atlanta in film production and journalism, and who have seen the turmoil on the streets of Atlanta over the last 3 weeks. And that's what our crucial conversation is about today. Across the nation and here in Atlanta, all of the discussion that almost all Americans have become a part of about police violence, and in particular, the shootings and violence against African American men and women in encounters with police in cities all across the country.
They're gonna find you like Paco Blau. America. I just checked my follow and listen.
When did you first see or hear about what had happened in Minneapolis with George Floyd? And when you learned about that or saw that video, what kind of reaction did you have to it?
You know, I couldn't bring myself to watch the video, and I still haven't been able to watch the video because I don't have to see it to know that the narrative is the same as it always has been. It's a black man begging for his life and being executed and lynched for the world to see. And like I said, I couldn't bring myself to watch it, but it broke my heart. I was devastated, I was angry, so it pushed me to action. And I've been protesting. I've been protesting almost nonstop, and I've been inspired. I felt inspired by what I've been seeing, and it's just a powerful moment. We're watching history being made, and I just feel compelled to be a part of it.
About a week passed between when everything started in Minneapolis and then when there was the shooting in Atlanta that sort of re-radicalized, it felt like, the whole situation. But in those first days before the shooting that occurred in Atlanta, how did you guys, did you perceive what was happening as that, okay, this is an away from here problem, or were you thinking this is just as much an Atlanta problem as it is anywhere else? Or but how did you perceive it in those first days? And then when then suddenly in the middle of that there's a shooting in Atlanta and a black man is dead here, how did that affect you?
I think I can speak for both of us when I say that it always feels personal. It never feels far away. Navigating America as a black person, anytime you hear of another life lost, you take it personally. You see your brother or your sister or yourself. And so that was what we were wrestling with for those first couple of days. Shonda?
Oh, I absolutely agree with Alana. You know, when I see George Floyd, that could be one of my brothers or my cousin, or when I think about Breonna Taylor, that could have been me. And I'd never thought of it as something that's happening in other cities, because there are people here in Atlanta who have been killed by the police as well. Anthony Hill, an Army veteran suffering with mental illness, he was killed by the police, naked and unarmed. And I was so moved by that entire case. His girlfriend had tweeted out, "My boyfriend was just killed by the police." I immediately reached out, and that was 6-7 years ago. We've remained good friends. I was with the family at the trial. So this has always felt incredibly personal to me. I did not know the family of Anthony Hill. I didn't know Bridget, his girlfriend at the time. I just felt the need to reach out to her and to let her know that I'm here for whatever she needs. And that turned into a 5-6 year relationship where we just supported each other. I went to the trial with the family, and it was just an experience. So I've never felt removed from the Black Lives Matter.
And how do you guys feel about how the protests of these last few weeks are different? They seem different to me, but how do they seem to you in terms of different from past Black Lives Matter type events like after Ferguson or some of the other the disturbances or uprising, whichever word we're going to use, in Baltimore and other cities? But something does seem to be qualitatively different now than in some of those previous ones. But do you see it that way?
Yeah, absolutely. I think specifically because of the pandemic and how we really don't have the ability to just go through life business as usual. We have to sit and see what's going on and act on it. And now we have more time, and honestly, it seems like more passion to just really say, okay, enough is enough. I was talking to some friends yesterday, and we really said that it seems like the pandemic has been really beneficial for the Black Lives Matter movement.
What about that there's been a lot of commentary about that the marches and the protests this time, that it's not just African Americans, wide range of people, lots of young white kids out there, lots of middle-aged white folks in places where there are not many black people. There have been lots of marches and protests that have been overwhelmingly white people, and so there is this mixture of things. I actually think some of the commentary forgets that there have been whites involved at times before too, but there definitely is something different. And these poll numbers that have come out where you've got like 71%, 74%, but 3/4 of Americans, including whites, express some kind of sympathy for the protest. Now, what exactly that means, is a little unclear. But is that different? I mean, do you sense that? But also, do you believe it?
So I'm actually really happy that you brought that up, because that is absolutely, to me, one of the biggest differences I see with this movement of Black Lives Matter is that there are so many white people there, and not just there, and taking up space, but actively standing between black protesters and the police, holding the picket line and saying, I'm going to use my body, I'm going to use my white privilege to protect my black brothers and sisters, willing to be arrested before they allow black protesters to be arrested, giving out supplies, helmets, to protect you from tear gas, rubber bullets, hand sanitizer, masks, you name it. It's felt very communal, and that's a different feeling that I've experienced this time around.
It seems like the protests are not going to stop. We don't actually even tend to need an organizer to say, here's where the march is going to be. I've seen Atlantans just literally show up at Centennial Olympic Park and be like, there wasn't a protest today, but now there is. So there's this passion, this fire, where we're not going to stop.
These protests and marches are different in some pretty important ways from the marches and protests of the 1960s, led by Dr. Martin Luther King or John Lewis. And there's such an emphasis in the history of the civil rights movement that those marches were incredibly carefully orchestrated, and marchers were trained, and there was an emphasis on everybody dressing in their Sunday best, and this idea which was a way of highlighting the brutality of the people who were opposed to the marches. And so if there was going to be an attack, it was going to be done by white supremacists, or arrests, it was going to be clear they were unjust. These protests obviously are very different, as they have been in the last several years. There's all been a very different kind of thing. But do you see that difference? And does it mean anything?
Well, I love history as sort of just a way to study and learn what we should do to move forward. Dr. King was such a face of the movement, and the Black Lives Matter movement right now doesn't have that face. And there were so many things that they did back then to train organizers in nonviolence, but I don't want to criticize the Black Lives Matter movement for being so different, because when you're losing your lives to racism, there's no right or wrong way to protest. But I do think that we would benefit from studying what the civil rights movement in the 1960s looked like in order to move forward in a very beneficial way. Shonda?
I think of a couple of things when you ask that question, and the first one being, I think it speaks so much to the brilliance of Dr. Martin Luther King in that he was able to organize a movement and have it so well organized and have it so set up from top to bottom where people were receiving training. Everything was very strategic. So I think the idea of us being able to recreate a Martin Luther King or expecting there to be another Martin Luther King, I don't think that that's realistic. Also, I think that we have to realize that Black Lives Matter prides itself on being a grassroots movement that is without structure. Well, I don't want to say without structure, but without hierarchies, without focal leadership. I think they pride themselves on that. And I think to some degree there are things that we can take from the 60s that are still useful, that will always be useful, but I think that in a lot of ways, new times calls for different types of protest. It calls for a new movement and new tactics. So I certainly have my critiques of the Black Lives Matter movement because, like you mentioned, sometimes on the front lines here in Atlanta, it has felt a little aimless. People will just show up and where are we marching? And no one is in charge. We're just out there. And it's a great experience, but sometimes it leaves you with the impression, what are we doing? How effective are we being? Yes, it feels good because it's therapeutic and it's something for us to do, but I wonder how much strategy is involved.
Yeah, we need a manifesto. Like the Black Lives Matter movement as a whole, we all have to have similar demands. We have the attention of the people that we've been trying to get the attention of for so long. So now that we have it, what are we going to say that we need? I would like to say it would be great to have some sort of hate crime bill, some sort of legislation on a constitutional level that fights for Black and brown lives. Just the way that the country was built on racism means that it's going to take something sweeping to really start to change the fabric of this country.
What about defund the police? That's something that's been thrown out there a lot. It's not always clear exactly what that means, but what do you guys think about just that defund the police, and what does it mean to you?
I think that defund the police can be a little ambiguous, or a lot ambiguous. Essentially, I think that the core of the message is we have to rethink and reimagine how we want our communities policed. What does law enforcement look like to us? How do we reshape this? Is this a system that can be reformed, or is it a system that needs to be abolished? And to me, the fact that we're even having that conversation, because months ago, a year ago, that would have seemed completely radical. But it's a conversation that we're having on the mainstream. It's on the forefront of everyone's minds, and that alone, to me, speaks to the power of this movement. In spite of all of the critiques that we may have, we're having this conversation. It's pushing that conversation. Let's just rethink and retool and redesign what law enforcement looks like in this country. And I think it's a conversation that is long overdue.
Well, you remind me of, I can't quote it correctly, but Dr. King, not long before his death, at one point was asked about a riot, that being the term that most commonly used then, a riot in a particular city, and his reaction to that was to say that, to me, a riot is the expression of a group of people who have been not allowed to speak. Sort of a group of people who ultimately built up to a point that this is the only form of expression that we can get to. At the same time that he was saying it's unfortunate, to see a whole part of a city burned, or particularly for a Black community to be damaged as a result of these things. But he said, but that's what it is. It's this expression of people who have not been able to speak, which I think is very powerful.
Yeah, when I think of defund the police, I think of this viral side-by-side photo. On the left, you have police officers in SWAT gear, and then on the right, you have healthcare workers who are basically protecting themselves from corona with trash bags and, makeshift masks. And then you start to say, why are we not making sure that other members of frontline workers are getting budgets to protect themselves as well? And do police officers really even need that much riot gear when at a peaceful protest?
That lack of a hierarchy of leadership and the fact that there's not a crisp set of demands being put out there, that also does make it complicated for the leadership of Atlanta or the leadership of Minneapolis or even the President of the United States to come out and say, okay, I agree to 1, 2, and 3, but we're going to have to argue about 4 and 5. And that encourages some sense of frustration too of, okay, everybody's sympathetic. There's obviously a terrible issue here. We've seen these terrible videos, these terrible things that have occurred. But now there is this sort of hunger for, okay, but where does this go? And what will get us to the next moment? Or is there a set of demands that could be answered that would then make you guys say, okay, we accomplished what we were trying to do, Is that even possible?
I do think that that's possible. I mean, like you said, defund the police is one of those bullet points that it has to be on a quote unquote manifesto, on a list of demands. I think a manifesto, a list of demands would absolutely be helpful just because it gives us a platform of issues that we can put into the hands of policymakers and politicians. I would love to see that come into play.
Yeah, I would love to see this issue not be a case-by-case situation. There should be some sort of overarching protection for the lives of the people who've been killed disproportionately at crazy rates. So there's a lot of gray area when it comes to, okay, do we convict this officer in this situation? Is there a way that we could say, when police kill a citizen, there's no question about it, they will be held accountable for their actions?
One of the things that I have thought about a lot is when people talk about reform rather than defunding the police, they say things like, well, we should ban certain types of chokeholds and
Rubber bullets.
Right, but my thing is New York has outlawed chokeholds, certain chokeholds by the police for some time now, and that didn't help Eric Garner at all from being choked to death by the police. So I just question how effective some of these notions of reform are going to be, because when something has been happening for so long, it's not an anomaly. It seems as though there's a system in place that is going to keep producing the same outcomes. I think that defund the police has to go, I think it has to be more than a hashtag. It has to be more than a saying. It has to go a lot deeper than I think a lot of people are thinking about at this moment.
It's also kind of complicated in a place like Atlanta where the majority of the police officers who work for APD are African Americans. I'm pretty sure that's true. If it's not a majority, it's very close. If we were talking about mass incarceration and if we were looking at an individual young African American man who's ended up in prison on some sentence that we would all look at and say that, wow, why is he in prison for 20 years for that? One of the sort of cynical ironies of that was that in Atlanta, there's a pretty good chance he was arrested by a black police officer, prosecuted by a black prosecutor. His case might have well been heard by a black judge. The obvious racial kind of structure of these things gets kind of confused, and so I think sometimes for somebody who's looking at that from the outside and isn't very sensitive to these issues, they might say, well, I don't get it. How can this have anything to do with race? Or if the police officer who shot and killed Rayshard Brooks, if that had been an African American officer, a lot of people would say, well, how can this be about race? But it still is, isn't it?
I think that it's about race in that black and brown people are disproportionately killed by the police more often. I would say it's a systemic thing. It's not, when you're talking about who's doing the killing and who's on the receiving end of the killing, that is a systemic thing. It has nothing to do with if the officer is black or white or Asian or Hispanic. It seems to be ingrained in the training that they receive. I'm not sure what it is, but it's a part of a system. It's not just about certain individuals, and it's not just about white police.
Have either of you had an experience in your lives of either an encounter you've had with the police or somebody who's well, or somebody in your family, or do you have that kind of signature story that that really influences the way that you perceive all this?
Oh, I have multiple.
Tell us one.
Well, I'm from a small college town, Milledgeville, Georgia. I don't know if you guys are familiar.
Yeah, Georgia College.
Right, Georgia College and State University. It's the bread and butter of that town. But also, as a result, arrests are a big part of the bread and butter of the police department and how the city gets a lot of funding. So I've had some run-ins with the police. One in particular that I'm thinking of, I'd gone out to dinner with my roommate and his girlfriend. Both of them are white. I'm sitting in the back seat. We're on the way back to the house. We get pulled over for no reason. They didn't ask for his ID, and he's the driver. They didn't ask about his girlfriend, who's in the passenger seat. They were inquiring about me. I'm in the back seat. I'm not driving. I had to step out of the car. I had to get searched. I think the idea was, who is this black person riding the car with these two white kids? It must be something going on. That's just one of the incidences that I've had with the police, where I've just been treated like a suspect for no reason.
For me, I would recall just a couple weeks ago at a peaceful protest when Atlanta police started forcefully arresting people for no reason, slamming them on the sidewalk. We actually covered it in Black in America 2020. I was there filming, and I just kept asking, why are you detaining them? Why are you detaining them? No one was doing anything.
Why did you detain them?
Everybody here has to move. Keep going.
We witnessed peaceful protesters on the sidewalk be slammed down on the ground. Why are y'all doing that? They're peacefully protesting. Why are y'all doing that?
You folks gotta keep moving.
One girl walked up to a few officers with her sign, and they smashed her on the ground and handcuffed her and threw her in the back of a cop car. There was very little compassion for the peaceful protesters and why we're out here doing what we're doing.
And so it was so ironic to me that while we were on the streets protesting for cops to not be brutal towards us, that's the very thing that they were doing.
In the specific case of Rayshard Brooks, you have that if you watch the tapes of the interaction between the officers and him, that there's this 40 minutes of dialogue or thereabouts between them, and for the most part, the cops by some people read it as are kind of arrogant and obnoxious, but on the whole, there's no indication of anything terrible is about to happen here. It could have been a training film about a DUI stop, kind of the steps that the police officers go through, and then the sobriety test that they give him. And so all of this is cruising along, and then suddenly you get to the moment that they then say, okay, we're going to arrest you, though he doesn't actually say those words, but he turns him around to try to handcuff him. Some people see that and say, well, why did he run? Or, he brought this on himself. The other thing I'll throw into this is that I'm making a film now, a documentary film that's about that deals partly with an incident in my hometown in Mississippi in the 1990s, where part of the story is that a white police officer, guy I went to school with, is the first officer to the scene of a car wreck, and there's a black driver who's DUI, and he tries to get away, and then in the darkness of this thing, they don't even have any contact with each other, but all of a sudden the driver, he's in the dark somewhere, and there's this muzzle flare, a shot comes from a gun that he's carrying, and so the white police officer fires back a couple of times. Well, when the dust settles and the light comes up, he's dead with a bullet in his head, the African-American man, and everybody assumes that it's the police officer. The police officer assumes that he shot him, just happened to hit him in the dark. But then it turns out, and I think this is actually true, the African-American man shot himself. He actually killed himself rather than be arrested. And when I first heard about that 20 years ago, I really was hit by the terror that has to be, held in, that leads somebody, even though he was drunk and probably his judgment was bad, and all sorts of things were at play too, but there was something that the possibility of being arrested was so terrifying, that to do such an extreme thing. And so when I saw this tape in Atlanta, I thought, wow, this is video of this thing I've been working on for the last 20 years, of a man who it may be kind of irrational, but who just said, I can't do this, and takes off.
Yeah, did you see the Rayshard Brooks video? He did an interview before he passed away discussing how horrible it was for him to be in prison. He was on parole during the time of his arrest, and he was going in his mind about all the things he could lose by getting arrested. So he talked about how the system was failing him. And that's something else that we should be thinking about is how can we help people just improve their lives and not be in this prison pipeline.
Yeah.
I know for myself, I have family members who got arrested at like 13 years old, and they're having such a hard time finding a way to this day at like 30 years old to find a way to stay out of jail. The system is meant to not just arrest and convict Black people, but to keep them in prison.
You know, a lot of arguments out there about the data of, you know, like, okay, what exactly is the disparity between how many African Americans end up being the subject of violence from the police versus whites, and, you know, how, like with all data, how you slice it really affects how it all comes out. But the one thing that's crystal clear is all of the kinds of studies that look at, you know, how many times an African American boy has had some sort of encounter with the police, even if it's just being questioned on the street corner by the time he's 13 versus the average white boy by 13. And that's where there's just this huge difference. And so my son, when he was 13, you know, had never had any kind of scary encounter with a white police officer. And so first time he's in any kind of trouble and, you know, and encounters a police officer, his reaction to that may well be totally different than his African American friend with him at the same time.
I wanted to ask you, as a white person, what are you doing to be actively anti-racist? I think we can agree that having these conversations is a wonderful start, and using your voice to give a platform to conversations like this. But what other practices are you implementing?
That's actually a complicated question for me, and it's sort of interesting to say it out loud because I've thought a lot about it. Because and I call it the dilemma of the good white, you know, because I'm somebody, you know, I grew up in this little town in Mississippi. My parents were Southerners, but they were much more moderate than, you know, most of their peers. And so, as it turned out, because of decisions they made, I didn't have anything to do with it, that they made the decision that when the schools in my little town were finally ordered to really integrate, to meaningfully integrate, that I then was in the first class of first graders in Mississippi to begin the first day of first grade together and go all 12 grades. And so I'm, you know, and people think that happened, you know, in 1954, but that didn't happen until 1970. And that's the case almost everywhere. Even in Atlanta, you didn't really have integrated public schools with Black kids and white kids going to the same schools until the 1970s. And so in some respects, I'm in this kind of pioneering group, and for whatever reason, I was really curious about these issues and interested in these issues beginning when I was a kid, you know, and this film that I'm making right now actually begins with this essay that I wrote in the 7th grade about a civil rights incident that had happened on the outskirts of town. And so one of the things about the current moment for me is that, you know, I've spent the last 40 years talking about race, writing about race. I wrote this book that, you know, that has become a kind of cornerstone of a lot of discussions about race in America. And so, you know, on the one hand, I'm like, well, hey, I'm the good guy, you know. Nonetheless, you know, in this moment, I can't help but say, okay, but, you know, I can't kind of sit on that. And it has prompted me to ask that question. Okay, what else should I be doing, or what have I failed to do in the past? And I don't, you know, mostly what I'm doing is trying to keep doing what I've been doing, but also be maybe a little sharper about the way that I, in particular, ask white people that I know or that I love. I mean, one thing I do think it was a big, like in my family growing up, my parents were more moderate, and so where I grew up, even though it was by comparison today, a kind of crazy, racist, you know, South Africa kind of environment, but my parents were very very insistent on that, like if I had ever used the N-word, it's a cliche to say this, but if I had ever used the N-word in front of my parents, or then they would have been incredibly angry with me. I would have been punished, and so I never even had to not do that. It was so ingrained. But even when I was a kid, I was confused because I knew that was absolutely forbidden. Yet all of my cousins and grandparents and aunts and uncles, with a few exceptions, well, they talked that way all the time, And so it was really this confusing thing to me that, well, wait a minute, the people that I love the most in the world do these things that I know are totally wrong, but they're the people that I love the most in the world. So what does all that mean? And when I look back on that, in hindsight, I think sometimes that, okay, there should have been more arguing. There actually should, like my parents and me later, there should have been more confrontation about this is not the right way to do things. And so I'm trying to focus on whether there are versions of that now that I have been lulled into.
Real quick, I want to go back to the question that you asked about Rayshard Brooks and sort of how the police were engaging with him and how he reacted to that. I think that it's incredibly hard for someone who is not black or brown to understand the feeling that comes over you when you see those blue lights in the rearview mirror. I mean, you could have not done anything wrong. You're not doing anything illegal. Your registration's good, your tag's good, your license is good, but it's just a feeling of uneasiness, and it's terrifying. And I can only imagine, much more so, you're a felon, you're out on parole, you tried to do what you thought was the responsible thing and pull over and get off of the road. It's just hard for people who have never felt that feeling to try to wrap their mind around being in that situation and not knowing how to react, knowing that if I do everything right and I announce every move that I'm making, okay, I'm going to reach for this and I'm going to do that. If I comply completely, I could be killed. If I resist, I could be killed. It puts you, I always say that it's like we're traumatized. We're absolutely traumatized by all of these images that we've seen. And when you're in that situation, it's hard to know what to do, what's the right move. You're scared. In his case, like I said, he's intoxicated. I just feel so many ways about that because I know for a fact I have lots of white friends who have done much worse. Pulled over with open containers.
Sure.
Illegal drugs in the car, what have you. And in a situation like that, I feel like if he were a white male, they probably would have said, okay, just leave your car here, you can walk. I think that the outcome would have been different. The conversation would have been different.
Or the white male might not have, not having the kind of anxiety that you're describing,
Right.
might not have tried to get away from them, or just
Right.
just the catastrophic sequence might just never have begun, and we would have never heard about any of this. In this bigger discussion we've had that's now been going on for really 20 years and really got a lot bigger during the time that President Obama was in office, but about generally mass incarceration and the earlier versions of these police violence debates that have come up. But interestingly, when these issues have been raised, like the disparity between the sentences for powder cocaine versus crack cocaine, and so that was something that finally kind of cut through, that, oh, wait a minute, that makes sense, that, African Americans who are the people who are more likely to have been charged with a crack cocaine offense, and the penalties for that are 100 times, or even, that was the reform. Originally it was like 1,000 times more harsh than for powder cocaine, which is the drug that whites are more. But this message sort of finally cut through that there's this huge difference in the penalties for crack cocaine and powder cocaine, and there's a racial disparity between these things, and that seemed to finally kind of resonate. But then the response to that was not to relax the penalties on crack cocaine, it was to make things more fair by making the penalties on powder more harsh. And there was some reduction, but across the board, what has happened is that rather than making the system less harsh and less draconian, it's been to actually make it a little more fair. So all of a sudden you end up with that 16-year-old white boy who gets arrested on a minor drug charge is not getting just discharged at the courthouse. He begins to be treated more like a 16-year-old African American. And I think that has happened. It's still a huge disparity. But I think that's one of the reasons why there are now a lot more middle-class whites who see the criminal justice system as something that's also a threat to them, or they've had an experience with their their cousin or their niece or nephew, who got in trouble, and suddenly it's like, this system is brutal, and it's just a little taste of what I think African Americans have experienced. But that may be part of why there's such a sea change right now.
To me, it's encouraging to see more white people talk about things like that, but it also it's kind of disheartening because I feel like if black people have been saying this for so long, and all it took was for you to experience a tiny morsel of what black people have been experiencing forever, how much of an ally are you? Like, did you think that we were lying the whole time? Were we making it up the whole time? I do think that it's going to take all of us to get this turned around. But that dynamic of white people who are just now coming on board, I question what brought them to that point. And I wonder, is it even relevant what brought them to that point? Is the important thing that, okay, you're here now and let's work and move forward and get this problem solved. So I struggle with that a little bit.
What do you think about the larger environment? Not to get too political sort of about it, but I also wonder about that in terms of the reaction that we're having now. So much more support, sympathy for this. If some of that is also a reaction to just the sense over the last several years that racial climate in the country has deteriorated, and President Trump has said things that really infuriated a lot of people. And I wonder about, is some of that white support partly a kind of liberal progressive pent-up unhappiness about the bigger picture, and then this crystallizes that somehow, before we got to George Floyd even, there was this rising level of anxiety in the country, lots of talk about whether the president, the things that he says are racist, or whether, and kind of what is that inflaming, and what does he mean by these things? And I wonder if some of the response to these killings just in these past few weeks is that there was a lot of fuel out there already, of fear and worry about the declining racial climate, and then these things happen, and it seems to just prove that, we're falling off a cliff, and that's been one reason why people have mobilized in such a big way. But
I think what has caused the rage to get to the level that it is at is really the video, George Floyd's video, and how there was this look of enjoyment on the officer's face as he had his knee on George Floyd's neck. And I think for anyone who watched the video, I'm like Shonda, I wasn't able to, but it just really put in your face like the evil that exists in this country. And I think that's mainly what has caused the uprising and to boil over. What about you, Shonda? I
think it's been a perfect storm of so many different events and things that have led up to this. Because like you said, I want to point out that America's always had racial tensions. It's always been there. I think the difference now is that everyone has a camera in their hands with their phones. We have social media now, things can go viral. I don't think anything's any worse than it's ever been. I think it's exactly what America's always been.
We just see it now.
We're seeing it now. It's more visible. This isn't a new America. It's not some new divided America that Trump brought about. I think that what he may have done was bring things to the surface that maybe people have been conditioned that it's not PC to say that. You can't say that anymore. Trump's made it okay for people to say what's on their heart. The conversations that they're having at home, things that they would say amongst family and friends, they're coming out in the open and saying it. And I think that also has created a group of white people who want to disassociate themselves from that. Like, they want to distance themselves. I'm not that type of white person. And I think it was also the combination of, you saw Ahmaud Arbery being killed in his neighborhood. Then you had Breonna Taylor, the EMT worker, who was murdered by the police in her house. Then on the heels of that, you had George Floyd. And these were so inexcusable, these acts of violence. And these were instances that weren't questionable. You couldn't argue, well, maybe he deserved it, jogging in his neighborhood. You couldn't argue, well, maybe she did something in her bed. Or, it was irrefutable evidence. And it was stomach turning. And people couldn't look away from it. And you can't explain it away. And I think all of those things just served as a catalyst for I think, a lot of white Americans to be like, and not just white Americans, people of all races, all over the world, to say, we can't be silent anymore. And I think one of the lines that you hear a lot at the protests from people who are not black is silence is compliance. And that's the different mindset to me, is that I think all of those things, like I said, they served as a catalyst, but they let people know it's not enough for me to just say Black Lives Matter. I got to get out there. I have to, they're searching for ways to support the movement and to support the black people that they know. And I think that's the difference.
So what do you guys think about the fact that George Floyd's murderers were arrested, but Breonna Taylor's are still roaming free? What do you think might be the reason for that?
One problem we have is that as a society, we just don't have a consensus anymore over what it is that the police are supposed to do now, and sort of how what our expectations are. And I think that the video evidence has sort of forced us to confront that. I mean, on the one hand, ever since human beings, we're figuring out language and operating in groups, we have to defend ourselves, and we have to trust that the guys out on the perimeter will make a decision that's consistent with our values as a group. And so we've always had this kind of idea, and there was always sort of a deal. There was kind of a contract, silent contract with the police that accepted that sometimes you're probably going to do things that will look bad the next day, but we're going to give you some latitude. We're going to trust that you're going to stay within the boundaries of our magical agreement, our unwritten agreement. And throughout history, I think there have been times that kind of deal gets out of whack, And for a long time in America, obviously part of that deal was you're going to treat black people really harshly. But I think that we're now in one of these moments where there's just a lot of the deal is not clear. And I think that's one of the things that police officers are kind of frustrated about. It's like, well, hey, what is it you do want me to do, exactly? And some of them are clearly going too far, but some of them are genuinely trying to figure that thing out. And so I think that translates into how these different incidents sometimes end up playing out so differently, And I mean, I hate to say this too, the way the law is written, the odds are pretty good that the officer involved in the shooting here in Atlanta, there's a very reasonable chance he'll be acquitted because the law allows police officers to use this force if they feel any kind of threat at all, And so obviously we've got a big disconnect between what people feel in their hearts right now and the way that the laws are written and the message that police have received. But I think that does translate into that from one city to the next city or one incident to the next, that you can end up with these really different outcomes, even with events that look pretty similar.
And Shonda, I know we're members of the LGBTQ community, and there was a murder of a trans man named Tony McDade that has largely gone unnoticed, even amidst all of the passion behind the movement. What are your thoughts as a queer woman about sort of the silence that surrounds a lot of the Black trans lives that are lost?
I think that, and it's interesting that you asked me that because I was having this conversation with a friend of mine the other day. I think as a Black queer person, you are expected to place your Blackness over your queerness. Does that make sense?
Yes.
We're forced into trying to prioritize one identity over the other, when in reality, I can only speak for myself, that's not how it works. I'm just as much as a queer woman as I am a Black woman, and I have to defend both of those standpoints. But I think in terms of why there isn't visibility, I think a lot of people see it as we have to stay unified with this one narrative, and it's almost like they don't make any space for different identities. I think just as a whole, Black culture, we have a lot of work to do in terms of unpacking homophobia, transphobia. But until we can get to the point where we say Black Lives Matter and we truly mean all Black lives, Black trans people and Black gay people, lesbians, people all over the spectrum, then we still have a long ways to go. And I think the silence on the loss of queer and trans Black lives, it just lets us know that we have so much more work to do.
So the Atlanta police chief, Chief Shields, has stepped down as a result of the killing of Rayshard Brooks. What are your thoughts on that?
You know, I don't know if I can say this, and if I can't, we can take it out. But I think that she saw a shit show coming, and that on the backs of the protests that were happening and the National Guard being called in. And I mean, downtown Atlanta looked like a war zone during the early stages of the protest here. And she faced a lot of criticism for that. This was probably the straw that just broke the camel's back. I can only speculate, but I think that was just a moment where she just walked away because she knows that this is not going anywhere anytime soon. I mean, I could only imagine what drove her to that point.
But she clearly felt the need to, particularly after having gone out on a limb and said, we don't have these problems in Atlanta, which probably was a foolish thing to say, given all the things that we do know, even if maybe it was getting better, but these problems are still here. And so it did seem to me like she needed, and probably believed that the city needed, a real, something to happen, something really, and so the idea that the police chief would resign. But you don't see that very often in public service. You see that with like companies, Boeing makes an airplane that crashes 3 times and kills all these people. And even though the CEO of Boeing isn't the one who made the design flaws, but it's on him for having this system that ultimately produced this thing. And in that respect, even though I think that the chief was admired by a lot of police officers and was viewed as a straight shooter, there was a lot of positive sentiment about her, but in the end, it's her police department, and these bad things happen, and so somebody needs to be accountable, I think.
I felt like essentially it happened on her watch, and like he said, she had to be held accountable for it.
So how do we move on, and in particular, to Georgia State graduates, what's the role of an urban university, particularly one like Georgia State, where it's a university that graduates more African-American men than any other institution in the country, and a lot of what it feels is special about it is that there is a kind of mix of people and backgrounds that happens at Georgia State that is sort of unusual. And it's right here in this urban center, and it's where a lot of the disturbances and protests in Atlanta happened. The building we're in had windows broken out and lots of broken windows around us for several blocks. So we're right at the heart of all these things, and it's a university that's the heart of that. Does the university have a part to play in all of this, and what would that be, or what should Georgia State students be thinking about as their part? But what do you think?
Yeah, I think President Becker definitely should make some strong stances in what is his position in all of this. How does he think that the university should navigate this while being on the right side of history? And many organizations and businesses have taken a stand, whether it's donating to the Justice for Breonna Taylor case or making sure that you're employing a certain amount of African American people that reflects the student body. I don't know about you, Shonda, but I had many white teachers here, but it didn't reflect the population. Like, you can look in the classroom and it's very brown, and then you look up at the front and that's not what you see. So what are the numbers? Mm-hmm. Like, what are the percentages of Black people that you have also teaching this Black student body? Mm-hmm. But I feel like that's a good question for you as well as a professor. What do you think that Georgia State should do?
Well, one thing, and I have a more clear answer to that than sort of in larger life in a way, but the classes that I teach are already very much about race in various ways, and they're about both how do you excavate history in a way to try to better understand the racial realities in the society today, and so how do you figure out what happened in 1900 or 1920, and what happens in those classes is students get involved in identifying an imprisoned person who's been dead usually for at least 100 years. But sort of this idea that there are all these people who were being victimized by the criminal justice system in 1900 or in 1890, And one of my messages in those classes is that every human life is actually an epic life. It's just, and basically it's the same as everybody else's life, that everybody falls in love, everybody has a child or wants to have a child or decides not to have a child but adores a different child, whatever, but everybody, there is love, there's loss, there's accomplishment, there's failure, and human lives repeat and repeat and repeat. When you look back and look at all these lives, like the Rayshard Brooks shooting could have happened in a way if there hadn't been video, and if there hadn't been all this stuff going on, it could have been something that was barely even noticed. The job in this class is to identify people who were deprived of their voices and bring them back to life. And there's the old phrase about that you die twice. You die first when your body dies, and the second time you die is the last time someone speaks your name. And I say to that class, I say, we're here to speak people's names again, and we're going to bring them back to life. And it may be a obscure life. It may even be the life of somebody who broke the law, and deserved to be punished. But it's a real life, and these are people who had value, and in a society that totally devalued them, the larger society. And the other class that I teach is about how to tell these kinds of stories. But I'm very much, and have had a lot of conversation with other faculty about how do we even more forcefully bring into every class a kind of discussion about what does all this mean, and the kind of conversation we're having here. For somebody who teaches computer science, how to design video games, that's a little more complicated. But it's still what we're talking about, and it's still the sort of thing that I think people are looking to do. So there's definitely a role there, I think.
Yeah. And I think GSU has done an exceptional job, for me personally, of making sure to sort of offer me a leg up with whatever skill sets I learned here. For example, Shonda and I co-produced a documentary called Sweet Auburn Blues that's all about the historically significant Sweet Auburn Avenue area, which is, it's providing us the resources to be Black storytellers and tell our stories, allowing us that platform so that when we want to continue to create, we have that track record of, I have already produced these things. So I always appreciate Georgia State for that.
What needs to happen, or how do we move on? And I don't mean that in the way that sometimes when people say, how do we move on? If you had a breakup with somebody and it just is dragging on and dragging on, finally somebody says, well, how do we move on beyond this? I still care about you, but how do we move on? But it's sort of, how do we shut this down is what that really means. And so when I say move on, I don't mean that, but I think that, in fact, that's what we're afraid of. People of goodwill are afraid of just a sort of, well, let's just shut this thing down. It's so exhausting, and that nothing really happens. But how do you see that? How do we move forward? Yeah, how do we move forward?
I think that people, first of all, have to realize that this is not just a trend. This is a movement that has been happening for a very long time. There are ways that you can get involved. There are organizations and organizers who have been on the ground doing this work for decades. So I would say we definitely have to do more than march. We have to plug into those organizations, support them financially or otherwise.
I would say support Black artists, read Black content, hire Black people, and just really, on an individual level, question yourself. Question your own biases if you're not a Black or brown person, or even if you are a Black or brown person, thinking about what Shonda was saying earlier about the Black community needing to sort of look at our homophobia. Like, I think white people need to be questioning themselves all the time and having conversations, getting uncomfortable, because I think that it's been beneficial for white people. This whole system of white supremacy in America is beneficial. And so you have to think about wanting the change that we're talking about, like really wanting it, and what does that mean? How do you get involved? How do you keep this conversation going?
You could do an entire series about how do we fix these problems in America that have come to the forefront. But I think that we have to realize that this has to be a sustained movement, and people have to dedicate themselves to this for the long haul, because like I said, this isn't a case of a couple of bad apples, because if you look at American history, there have been bad apples for hundreds of years. So it's not just a couple of bad apples, it's a system that keeps producing these outcomes. So in order to get change, there has to be either a dismantling of these systems or a complete overhaul of these systems. And I think that we have to take some time and figure out what that looks like. How committed are we to seeing a different, better America? So I think those are the kind of questions that people have to ask, and we have to be willing to really commit ourselves to doing the work to see long-term and long-lasting change.
I think allyship is always what white people say they are when they say they're allies to the Black community. But I encourage people to get out of the allyship stance and be actively anti-racist every day. I think that's how you can actually start to make changes. We've been fighting for hundreds of years. We're tired. Like, we need y'all to step up and help us with our fight, be part of it, even become leaders in it. Oftentimes at protests, for example, you'll see Black people shouting very loudly, or they're leading the crowd and things like this. I want to see white people doing that too. I want to see the anger in the way that we feel it when it happens. It should be like you're losing your brother and sister too.
I want to go back to something that you mentioned about how when you were growing up, sort of like the racial politics that your immediate family had was completely different than members of your extended family. When we talk about crucial conversations, white people have to get comfortable with the idea that they're going to have those conversations with their family members. And I think that's where the frustration is a lot of times with the quote unquote cancel culture and people saying, you know what, it's not my job to teach you. And it's not our job to, and when I say our, I mean us as Black and brown people. It's not our jobs to go and to help white people understand the ways in which they're participating in racism or the ways that they benefit from white privilege. Those are conversations that white people need to have with their own family members and their own friends. It has to get to the point where you're willing to make things uncomfortable at Thanksgiving or your family function when your uncle tells a racist joke, or, you know what I mean? So I think it has to be more than just, I'm gonna put a Black Lives Matter sign in my front yard. And I went to a couple of protests and I took some selfies and it was cool. It has to go deeper than that. I'm super encouraged that from what I have been seeing from white friends, it lets me know that yes, we have a long way to go, but we are in so much more of a better place to engage together than we were 4 months ago, 2 months ago, 3 months ago. So I think that we're well equipped for the long haul.
I'm glad that you two are heading out into the world thinking the way that you're thinking and doing the things that you're doing. That's really great. Well, thanks for talking with me.
Thank you for having us.